This week on Dialogue, leaving without losing, the war on terror after Iraq and Afghanistan. Welcome to the Woodrow Wilson Center in Washington, D.C. I'm John Molesky. Each week, Dialogue explores the world of ideas and issues in international affairs, history, and culture. Our guests this week are Mark Katz and Robert Litwak. Mark Katz is a professor of government and politics at George Mason University. His latest book is this one, Leaving Without Losing, the War on Terror After Iraq and Afghanistan. Robert Litwak is Vice President for Scholars and Academic Relations at the Wilson Center, where he also serves as Director of International Security Studies. Gentlemen, welcome to Dialogue. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having us.
Mark, let me begin by referring to something you say early in the book, where you say one of the reasons you're writing this is because we need to think differently about the so-called war on terror, which suggests we're not thinking clearly about it now. So what is the problem?
Well, for me, what the present situation is reminiscent of is the 1970s, when the U.S. withdrew from Indochina, when there were predictions that terrible things were going to happen as a result. And terrible things did happen. The Marxist revolution spread, to an awful lot of countries. And yet, by the end of the 1980s, communism had collapsed, and it seemed that it was clear that America had won the Cold War. And so what I'm basically thinking is, my thought for this was that the U.S. had become overextended in Indochina, and then it did a lot better after it ended that overextension. Let our adversaries become overextended, and they were not able to cope with the overextension to the extent that we were. And so I'm thinking that, obviously history never repeats itself, but that the U.S. has been overextended in Iraq and Afghanistan, an awful lot of resources devoted to these two enterprises, neglecting so many others, and that it seems to me that withdrawing from Iraq and Afghanistan is not the end of the story, not the end of American influence, nor is it the triumph of America's opponents. And that there are opportunities for us to pursue, just as there were after we left Indochina.
Another comparison you make to the Cold War is the length of the conflict. Could you comment on that and how you looked at the various different potential starting points and ending points?
Right. I think that the war on terror has been sort of officially going on since 9/11/2001, and obviously it's been on for over a decade, and that's an awful long time. But I pointed out that the Cold War lasted for a lot longer. From the end of World War II up until 1989 or 1991, whichever date you prefer. But if we think about it, in many respects, it even began sooner, sort of the struggle against communism with the rise of the Soviet Union in 1917 with the Bolshevik Revolution. And if we want to even go back further, with the rise of Marxism as a revolutionary movement in the mid-19th century. So this was a movement that lasted an awful long time. And I suspect that radical Islamism can also last a long time, but that ultimately, it's not so much what we do about it, but that there are internal contradictions within this movement that tend to weaken it, just as occurred with the Marxists.
Rob, I want to get your thoughts on these parallels to the Cold War. And another observation that Mark makes in the book is that during the Cold War, no matter what the situation or conflict, a sub-theme, indirectly or directly, it seemed to be about the United States and the Soviet Union, or the United States and its allies. Is there a similar parallel in this time frame when you look at the global scene, whatever the conflict, an undercurrent is this war on terror?
Well, kind of one parallelism is that in the post-Cold War era, you've had rising powers and a increased stake even by powers like China in this so-called liberal international economic order, such that when Al-Qaeda blew up Wall Street and attacked the Pentagon, the Chinese and the Russians saw that it was in their interest to deal with global terror because it posed a threat to the proper functioning of the system. And those were the terms under which the United States went into Afghanistan in after 2001. And in Afghanistan and Iraq, there was mission creep, and it sort of morphed. I mean, initially the United States was going after the people who carried out the 9/11 attacks. Al-Qaeda was there. It was being protected by the Taliban, so that a decapitation, taking down the Taliban regime, was necessary. In the case of Iraq, different set of circumstances, but in 2003, the Pentagon beforehand had been talking about just decapitating the Saddam Hussein regime. And in both cases, no one dreamt that these wars would go on for nearly a decade, and it's because it shifted from a counter-terrorism campaign into a counterinsurgency campaign linked to democratization and nation building. And I think that Mark's book brings these distinctions out very well. And whether going back to a more narrow kind of counterterrorism strategy without a sense that we can, democratize these states, let alone build kind of institutions and proper functioning, a kind of a more modest sense of what we can do, would be appropriate, and to take into account where terrorism, the kind of how terrorist centers have shifted. I mean, the concern now is about Yemen and different parts of the world, the Horn of Africa. It is shifted from the area where we've spent a lot of time, invested, paid in blood and treasure, to areas outside. So I would, my own strategic preference is more kind of a focus on counterterrorism, that is going after people who pose a direct threat to the United States, to be not to take a Cold War or cue from the Cold War, but even before the Cold War, being an offshore balancer. There's a whole debate in international security now about the role, whether the United States should pursue a policy of restraint, being offshore, and then intervening when you see kind of a conjunction of factors, threatening factors come together that would directly threaten the United States. That's sort of an alternative version that's out there right now. Mark Katz's book is superb and really kind of informs that debate about where we should go from here. But I think that, just back to my main point, it was sort of this distinction that's been framed in terms of a counterterrorism strategy versus a counterinsurgency strategy linked to nation building. And that's really, I think, where we went off the rails.
Part of that framing has to do with the terminology. And you sort of vet war on terror and end up coming back to it, even though there are some deep flaws in the terminology. But nobody's come up with anything that has worked better.
That's for sure. I guess one of the things that strikes me is that obviously since 9/11 and really before, the people who we oppose are terrorists, but they're much more than terrorists. They are revolutionaries. Osama bin Laden was a revolutionary leader. It's not a question of whether we like him or not, but that he had an idea which inspired an awful lot of people. And this, I think, is the power of a transnational revolutionary leader, that they can, set forth a narrative which, for a large number of people, identifies what their problem is, identifies who their allies, who their enemies are, and identifies the solution, which is always violent revolution. And then, of course, promises the paradise afterward. Now, transnational revolutionaries are never good at delivering that last bit, but they can inspire a lot of people to bring down governments and to either come to power or just cause an awful lot of problems. And that, I think, is part of the key. It's not, in other words, they're not simply something that needs to be defeated, that their idea has to be discredited. And they're, in fact, often turn out to be far better at this than we are. In other words, that as they gain strength, and which is very worrisome for us, then they start to do things that cause them problems, and they call down, sort of three factors upon themselves. It was not just that we oppose them, but all kinds of regional actors, in other words, whom they threaten and whom we can work with. The other thing is that, wherever they come to power, they behave badly. They kill a lot of people, and they become pretty unpopular. That whatever, promises, that some people may have hoped for turn out to be absolutely false. And so it creates an opposition. We don't create it, but they themselves create it. And then finally, what they end up doing is they end up in hostilities with one another. That authoritarian revolutionaries, people who see violence as a solution, who cannot cooperate with us, they can't cooperate with each other for very long, if at all. And so I think that these are vulnerabilities in transnational revolutionary movements that we have exploited in the past during the Cold War, and that are still available for us, and which in fact may come more to the fore now that we are leaving.
When bin Laden was alive and he provided a focal point, Al-Qaeda, bin Laden, we could define the enemy that specifically. In the post-bin Laden world, is it even constructive to try to talk about this as one thing when there isn't a single enemy? There's no nation state. Mm-hmm. There's not even a significant leader of this group that perpetrated 9/11. Is it useful for us to think about it as one thing?
Not at all. And I think that, unfortunately, I think we have tended sort of worst case analysis.
And aren't we continuing to do that?
Yes. I mean, sort of the problem with worst case analysis is that it assumes that there's a lot of people who oppose you out there. They must be linked together. And so, it's foolish not to think that they are. It's naive to think that they're somehow separate or separable. But in fact, they are separate. And it's an awful lot of problems to deal with. So what it means is that instead of one huge problem, is that you have a lot of smaller problems, and that what that means is that dealing with any one small problem won't end the problem as a whole. But that I think it's important to understand that, to keep it in perspective, that maybe the solution isn't one solution for everything, but that one has to deal with these conflicts and crises one at a time. That for the various Al-Qaeda affiliates, Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, Al-Qaeda in Iraq, Al-Qaeda wherever, that the people who fight for them, they're mainly interested in local causes. Now, it's not that we're going to ever please these people, but that if we can help ameliorate whatever situation has given rise to these people, we can marginalize and isolate these guys in these places. Now, that's not an easy thing to do. If it was easy, we would have done it. But it does require a different mindset. In other words, it requires the desire to think of it one problem at a time. And just as with the Cold War, with the war on terror, an awful lot of policymakers and the public in general have preferred to think of it as one big problem, but it's not. It's a lot of small ones.
Rob, you used the term counterterrorism as sort of the new organizing or focal point. Does it hold up to the kind of analysis Mark just talked us through, or does it also begin to fray when you start to go situation by situation?
Well, I think counterterrorism is a term that's used, and it's sort of synonymous now with a more economical approach to it, just to go after kind of the bad guys.
Is this sort of what Joe Biden has advocated for?
Well, there's been a tension between just going after the people who are threatening us versus trying to deal with the underlying conditions that allow them to kind of operate. And the metaphor that's been used is, you got to drain the swamp. I mean, and extending that metaphor would be dealing with some of the conflicts and problems of domestic, governance that give a fertile ground to these types of groups to operate. And the rejoinder was, we need to drain the swamp. Yeah, but we also have to shoot some alligators. And we've been shooting a lot of alligators. The Obama administration, through the drone program, has decimated the top ranks of Al-Qaeda to the point where it's not functioning in the way it was able to function, certainly before 9/11 and even in the last decade. And yet there are conditions where Al-Qaeda has had some receptivity and resonance with the local population, throughout largely, in the Muslim world. And there it has to do with good governance, local conflicts. I mean, what was bin Laden? He has been described as a primal scream against modernity. That states where states where the domestic governance is corrupt and ineffective, and where they've tried all secular options, so it seemed Arab socialism, nationalism, etc. What's left other than, okay, well, let's go for an Islamic Republic and go back to kind of a more kind of austere version of what the society should be. You see sort of resonance of some of that in the Arab awakening, and I think that's a real cause of concern of kind of what the successor kind of governments are going to be there, and whether the successor governments where authoritarian regimes have fallen will be able to deliver in any meaningful ways. And there's been a lively debate among kind of regional experts, sort of contrasting certain parts of the world, the Islamic kind of zone, with like East Asia, where you've had GDP of Egypt and South Korea were the same in 1953, and look at where these societies are now. So I think, and Mark's book brings out sort of the richness of this. It's a sort of a multi kind of layered, situation where the terrorism manifestation is sort of a reaction to kind of underlying conditions going on. The United States neither has the means nor really the expertise or the ability to kind of get in and fix these societies. So how do we strike a balance as a country? And I think, the minimalist version is this counterterrorism strategy where if you see al-Qaeda, if we were to see now al-Qaeda coming together as it did before 9/11, we would not wait for a local government to react. The United States would take action, and has through the drone program, which raises thorny issues of sovereignty and conduct, rule of law and rules governing war, those kinds of questions. But that's sort of where we're at now in kind of managing these tensions.
I want to go through, Mark, some of the things you bring up as potential outcomes after post-U.S. withdrawal from Iraq and Afghanistan, and get you to give us sort of a quick summary of what the thought is. And Rob, at any time, please jump in with any additional questions or commentary. But first is this fear of radical Islamic takeover. If we leave a void, power loves a void, and something's going to fill it.
Well, I think that that's obviously a possibility, and one cannot dismiss that. But I think it's fascinating that, it's just at the point that, we were leaving Iraq that we saw the Arab Spring take place, and that obviously, some of these were governments that were closely allied to us, and, we've been very, wary about what's going to replace them. But what fascinates me is that, al-Qaeda was caught off guard as well. This is a small, secretive group that they don't really feel very comfortable with huge mass movements which they can't control, and which they were, fairly irrelevant to, and that they have rivals. In other words, that the Muslim Brotherhood in particular in Egypt, this is an organization that's been in existence long before al-Qaeda, sees them as upstarts basically. Now, what is the actual nature of the Muslim Brotherhood? We're still, I think, in the process of finding that out. But they do seem to, be interested in gaining and retaining public support, which was something that al-Qaeda never seemed to be terribly concerned about. And so I think that basic thing is important. In other words, that we can work with them. It seems to me that they're going to make mistakes, and there are sort of authoritarian tendencies, but it strikes me that they're a lot more moderate, and that this isn't, there's going to be a learning process for these guys, but they're interested in governance, and so, I think that that's something we can work with. That's far better for us than the triumph of an organization like the Taliban in particular. So that's good, and I think that what we've seen with regard to the Arab Spring is that in all these places it's local concerns that come to the fore, and I think that al-Qaeda can't really deliver on a lot of these things. It's one thing if there's no other opposition available, and al-Qaeda more or less has the monopoly. But now that sort of the floodgates have burst, and there are people out there who can sort of capture the Islamic space, if you will. The real bad guys just don't have much of a chance, it seems to me.
Another possible outcome that you talk about, which is one of these that falls into the counterintuitive classification where this could work in our favor, even though some people fear that a withdrawal is going to work against us, is something you mentioned briefly earlier, that a rift among radicals, or that people who don't play nice with others usually don't play nice with each other as well. If both of you could talk about what you see after the withdrawal of troops from both of these countries, how that scenario might play out.
Well, we saw this once before when the Soviets left Afghanistan, and the Pakistanis were supporting the Mujahideen. And one of the first things that happened was that Pakistan's relations with the Mujahideen deteriorated rapidly, and they ended up sort of, creating the Taliban, and it came to power. But did Pakistan gain from that? And now it appears that relations between Pakistan and the Taliban groups are not easy. In other words, it's not clear that Pakistan's going to have the puppet that it seems that it would want. And I think the same with Iraq. That everyone has feared, what did America do? But we helped raise a Shia government in Iraq, which is going to be beholden to Iran. Well, it seems like this Prime Minister Maliki is a pretty tough guy, that he seems to be bent on asserting his control. So it seems to me that it's a real stretch to believe that he's going to suppress all his local opponents and then just turn everything over to Iran. I think that, in fact, that he, there's not much gratitude in international relations. That maybe he got lots of help from Iran, but once he's in power, it's basically like, thanks, goodbye. I think with regard to these people, and there's a lot of that Iran is not exactly popular in Iraq. In other words, that the legacy of the whole Arab-Persian differences, and the more immediate legacy of the Iran-Iraq War, in which an awful lot of people were hurt, and they still haven't forgiven each other for this. I just don't see the feared Iranian expansion into Iraq as just being possible. And I guess the way to think of it is that if we couldn't pacify Iraq, can Iran? With far fewer resources? I really don't think so.
Well, what it sounds is, the way I interpret what you're saying is that there's almost this law of unintended consequences. A U.S. presence dictates a certain momentum. You take that out, and other things will percolate up. When you go back to the Cold War, the United States leaves Vietnam, and suddenly Sino-Soviet tensions move to the forefront. What is your analysis, Robin?
I would pull the optic back, and historians talk about agency. You talk about external agency and internal agency of change.
What does that mean in lay terms?
In lay terms, it means is change within a society, does it come organically from within, or does the impetus come and do the levers of change, are they imposed from outside? In the United States, after 2001, took down 2 regimes in the region directly through external intervention. And the first was in Afghanistan, was done as sort of self-defense. No one really questioned the U.S. intervention in Afghanistan. We'd been attacked out of Afghanistan. Iraq, hugely contentious. Now, 10 years plus into its presence in Afghanistan, the presence of the United States has become the issue for many of the Afghans, and you see how unpopular it has been, even if it's there not as a kind of an imperial force trying to exert colonial control. I mean, the objectives are things like trying to allow young girls to go to school, etc. But you have Afghans in the army, assassinating American soldiers. The presence there is, look at how the bottom has dropped out there. And it really kind of goes to the Afghans may be divided left, right, and center, but increasingly they're agreeing on that an occupying force is illegitimate in the country. And in Iraq, you had a similar kind of dynamic where now there are calls that, if only the United States had retained a residual presence. How would a small force be able to affect Iraqi domestic politics? It would more likely become the focal point of Iraqi opposition. So it's, what is the policy conclusion? Does that mean that we axiomatically can't get it right? Probably, but 10 years into, we've just had these dual experiences of lengthy, direct occupations, and I think we've pretty much kind of taken that one for both financial reasons and in terms of what the outcomes have been, taken that one off the table.
Does any redefinition of our approach wait till after the election?
I don't think so. I think that the Obama administration is obviously moving in this direction, in the sense that they set these withdrawals in motion, one completed, one in the process. So I think that the basis for thinking about this, I think, has been set, because I don't think that they're going to simply stop thinking about this part of the world. We can't afford to do that. So I think that we had a situation where so much of our resources were spent on two operations, which were very difficult. And then just, in terms of an investment analogy, we're now rebalancing the investment, if you will, and we now have, a lot more resources available for other things. Not massive intervention, but helping those who want to resist this kind of terrorism themselves. And they're the ones who should be doing it anyway.
Gentlemen, our time is short, but Rob, you often talk about, when I've talked to you about things, about the takeaway. Mm-hmm. So that's what I want to ask both of you in the remaining time. What is the biggest takeaway for you from Mark's book? And then, Mark, the question is, what's your intended takeaway? What do you want people to walk away with in about 30 seconds for each of you to respond
I think
to that?
Mark's book is sort of a brilliant analysis, and it really points to some sort of counterintuitive, conclusions that we should consider in terms of the consequences of our withdrawal and the applicability of some strategies that have worked in earlier historical periods in different contexts that might be reshaped and adapted to current circumstances.
I think for me, the message I want to convey is that withdrawal is not defeat, nor is intervention a victory. In other words, that we have to think, intelligently, we have to think strategically about what we're doing in foreign policy. And, what I hope is that my book, if it doesn't provide the answers, it at least raises questions, and that will help people think about this problem.
Well, both of you helped us think about it today. Thank you for that. Complexity is certainly a word that comes to mind. Leaving without losing, it's not an easy solution, but this is a book that will help you think through it. We'll return next week with another edition of Dialogue. Until then, for all of us at the Wilson Center, I'm John Molesky. Thanks for joining us.
We'd like to hear from you. Please send your questions or comments to dialogue@wilsoncenter.org. You can also follow us on Facebook. Search Dialogue Radio and Television. Our host Twitter feed is twitter.com/John Milewski. Dialogue is a co-production of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars and MHZ Networks. Dialogue is available via broadcast, cable, satellite, and telco on MHZ Worldview throughout the United States. To see how to watch where you live, visit www.mhznetworks.org.